Welcome back to the Faith and Focus podcast. I'm Laura, and in this third episode of our OCR A-level religious studies series, we're tackling three key areas that challenge belief in God and the coherence of religious faith. Today's episode will cover the problem of evil and suffering, religious experience, and challenges to religious belief. So let's get going. Segment 1, the problem of evil and suffering. So why do you need to know this? So this is one of the most frequently examined topics in the philosophy paper because it directly challenges belief in an all-powerful, all-loving God, which means that you have to engage in all the classical theory and any modern criticisms regarding belief in God. Being able to evaluate those responses is essential for top-level analysis. So where do we start with problem of evil? Well, we start with the inconsistent triad. Okay, you will probably have seen this as a triangle. So you've got the idea of, and this comes from Epicurus, and it comes from then later on, a lot later on, J.L. Mackie. So this is the idea that if God is omnipotent, i.e. all-powerful, and God is omnibenevolent, or all-loving, and omniscient, or all-knowing, evil exists. So those three qualities of God and the fact that evil exists lead to a logical inconsistency. So then we question, so if God knows about evil and he can stop it and he wants to stop it, why doesn't he? Which then leads to the questions, well, if he can't stop it, then that is not omnipotence. But if God won't stop it, then he's not omnibenevolent. So it leads us to question those qualities of God, and that causes a problem. Okay, so going into this further then, we've got the idea of St. Augustine and Augustine's theodicies. So this is based on the story in Genesis and the fall of Adam and Eve. Alright, so God creates a perfect world. Evil comes through human misuse of free will. So when Adam and Eve are told not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but they do it anyway, and then they suffer the consequences, right? We have free will in that instance, but we have to suffer the consequences of that when we've been directly told not to do something. So Augustine says that evil is not a substance, it's a privation, all right? And a privation is an absence of something. So when you go camping, you have a privation sometimes of clean facilities to wash and dress and stuff like that. So a privation, in this instance, evil is not a thing, it's just a lack of good. It's a privation of good. And natural evil, apparently, is punishment for original sin, according to Augustine. So, strengths and weaknesses of this argument. Strengths, it preserves the idea of God's perfection and goodness, so that is not in question. It uses the biblical narrative and it uses doctrine as its basis, so it's going to be in accordance with doctrine and in accordance with the Bible. It's not going to conflict with it. And the attributes of evil are down to human choice. So it's our choice to not do the good thing. It's not divine action that causes it to be a bad thing, which is different and it's important. So weaknesses of that argument relies on a literal interpretation of Genesis. So obviously, if you do not believe that the Bible is literally true, then that could cause a little bit of conflict for that. It does blame humanity for suffering. So it says that our suffering is our fault, which is not a particularly positive version of humanity, is it? So remember that. And it also raises the question that if God is omnibenevolent, why would he allow a world where people could fail so catastrophically? Because if you think about it, we are, as human beings, we do fail catastrophically. You know, we have genocide, we have war, we have, even on an individual level, you know, people commit murder and fraud and all these horrible things. So there are lots of things where you would question, well, if God's supposed to love us, why would our world be constructed in such a way that we almost can never achieve what God wants us to achieve. So next theodicy is from Irenaeus, and it's then developed by John Hick in the 20th century. So Irenaeus and John Hick say that evil is there and God allows it as a test or a challenge for human development. So we suffer because then we develop good things in terms of our personality. We develop virtues. So we have things like courage, compassion, loyalty, etc., etc. And there's also this idea that we've got eschatological justification. Eschatology is what happens after death. Okay? So this theodicy says that everything will be made right when we die. So this is a trial and it's a test in our life on earth, but after death, we'll get the benefit of that by going to heaven. And you will have heard of John Hick's veil of soul making, so that it's our idea of our souls are prepared by our life today for what's going to come after death. Strengths. It explains why God might allow suffering. Okay, so that's one aspect of that inconsistent triad, is why is suffering there, why is evil there if God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. Well, it explains why that might be the case if it's there for our own good. It makes sense of long-term moral growth. So as a species, we usually get better and more wise as we go on over our lives. So that explains the need for that. And it's also inclusive because it suggests that everyone will be saved at the end of time. Weaknesses. It doesn't justify extreme suffering. So in a lifetime, everybody expects things that are hard. So it might be that you lose your job and you have a period where you're a bit skint, for want of a better word. It might be that you have somebody really close to you that dies and you are grieving. And everybody expects a life where that is part of it. But nobody expects the extremes of things like genocide. So why do we need the extreme, would be the question. Like, what is the purpose of that? Some people die without the opportunity to morally develop. So there are some people who don't get any better throughout their life, and they are just not good people, and they don't morally develop. Or people die young, so they haven't got a chance to be better people. So what happens then? And it also assumes a future life, i.e. life after death, that can't be proven. So we've got no factual basis for there being life after death. As a Christian, you believe in that because that's what you are taught, but there's no actual scientific, evidence that there is a life after death. So you need to think about, as an evaluation tip, which theodicy, so Augustinian or Irenaeus, which one better balances belief in God with the reality of suffering? Which one looks at scripture and reason and respects them both? There is no right answer to that question. That's just a thought point. So if you were to get a question in your exam on that you think about, in your mind, which one is better at balancing belief in God and the reality of the fact that we live a life in which we suffer. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so some key quotes for that. Evil is a privation of good. That is Augustine. And the best of all possible worlds comes from Leibniz. Okay, so segment 2 then, looking at religious experience. So why do you need to know about religious experience? So it's often used as evidence for the existence of God. So we've talked about the existence of God. We've talked about, I suppose, evil and suffering being a question mark about whether God exists or not. But religious experience often is the baseline for a lot of religious people about why they actually believe in God, because they believe that things have they believe that God has intervened in their life in some way. Right, so we need to think about then the different types of religious experience. So you should have come across these already. So you should think about a mystical experience, a conversion experience, and a corporate or shared experience. So a mystical experience is one where you feel a oneness with the divine on an individual basis. So, for example, Teresa of Avila had a religious experience that was a mystical experience. Joan of Arc had mystical experiences. A conversion experience is exactly what it sounds like. It's when you have a sudden change in belief. So St. Paul on the road to Damascus, he was Saul, he persecuted Christians, and then he had an experience on the road to Damascus which changed his mind, and he became one of the most important Christians in history as a result. And then corporate religious experience is a shared religious experience. So that is when more than one person feels that thing at the same time. So you could argue that there were religious experiences in Medjugorje, which is a shared religious experience. There were lots of people that felt the same thing at the same time. So then we get on to William James. All right, so William James has characteristics for religious experience. So there are some qualities and characteristics that he would describe it as. So he would say that religious experience is ineffable, noetic, transient, and passive. So it's ineffable. If something's ineffable, it means it can't be described, or it can't be described very easily. And a common feature of religious experiences is that people struggle to explain exactly what happened, or exactly who it is that they've had the religious experience from, or whatever. So Saint Bernadette, when she had the experiences with Mary, she didn't know that that was Mary, and she couldn't explain who it was initially. So the second one, it's noetic, i.e. you know something as a result that you didn't know before. So again, Saint Bernadette knew where the spring was. She didn't know that before. She knew things that Mary told her that she didn't know before. There would be no other way of her finding out that information. Religious experiences are transient, i.e. they're very short. Okay, so even if they are repeated, the actual experience itself is not very long. And they are passive. So as the person or people involved in the religious experience, it happens to you. You are not in control of the religious experience. Okay, so then we've got Richard Swinburne's principles, all right, to assess religious experiences. So he says we've got the principle of credulity and the principle of testimony. So, principle of credulity, we should believe things are as they appear. So if you get a religious experience and you think that is Mary talking to me, then the principle of credulity says we should believe that. Okay? And the principle of testimony says that unless we've got a good reason not to trust a person's account of something, we should trust it. So if I tell you that I've had a vision of Mary, and I'm normally a very trustworthy, honourable person, why wouldn't you believe what I'm saying? So challenges to this idea of religious experience. So Freud. So Freud argues that religious experiences are illusions, and they are rooted in psychological need. So such experiences, he believed, arise from repressed desires and human longing for a protective father figure. And that could especially be if you are in a position where you might only have had your mother that's been involved in your life. Or you've got a father that's very distant or whatever. So religion functions like a neurosis. It provides comfort, but it doesn't give you truth. Okay, so that's Freud's response. Now, a strength of that response is it's a very scientific and psychological explanation. And it's quite a modern interpretation of a criticism, if you like, because that is 20th century. The only problem with that is quite, as a weakness of that argument, it's very reductive, and it doesn't necessarily correlate that somebody who is neurotic and who is who has psychosis, for example, doesn't necessarily correlate that they're the ones that have the religious experience. So a lot of religious experiences occur in healthy individuals across diverse places and diverse contexts. So it can even happen to people that are technically non-religious. So that is a negative or a weakness of Freud's argument. Okay, so Persinger, this is the idea of the God helmet. Okay, so he conducted experiments with the God helmet, and that simulated the area, it kind of went into the areas of the brain that people who have religious experiences, that's what lights up in their mind. So they stimulated that in other people by using magnetic fields. Okay, and participants who used the God helmet, they reported feeling a divine presence, so God or, whatever is divine to them. And that would suggest then, Persinger argues, that you can induce a religious experience. So it's not necessarily something that is arbitrary, it's something that you can create artificially. So, strength of that, it supports the idea that experience is a brain-based phenomenon rather than encounters with the divine. So it's something that happens in your temporal lobes and can be stimulated with weak magnetic field. It's not something that is external being done to you. However, a weakness is that those results are quite inconsistent and not necessarily replicable. Now, with any scientific experiment, you have to be able to replicate it, and that hasn't been the case with the God helmet. And critics argue that the context and expectations might have influenced the outcome. So if people went into that experiment knowing what it was and knowing that it was trying to induce this idea of a religious experience, they might have been more susceptible to it in the first place anyway. So key quotes then from this section. Religion is a universal obsessional neurosis. That's from Freud. And the feelings, acts and experiences in relation to what they consider the divine. That's William James. Okay, segment 3. This is challenges to religious belief. Alright, so you've got to be able to assess whether belief in God is credible, looking at it from secular and scientific perspectives as well as religious perspectives. So obviously you've got the arguments for the existence of God, from Aquinas, etc. But then are there things in psychology, sociology, generalized science that can either support that or would go against it? This is where you can really use these as arguments and get your AO2 up there. So Freud, again, argues that religion is a form of wish fulfillment that arises from a psychological need. We've said that already. God is an illusion created by the mind to provide comfort and security in a dangerous world. And religion mirrors the relationship between child and parent. So that idea of God as the protective father figure. So strengths of that, it's supported by psychoanalysis and human behaviour studies. And it explains why people are drawn to religion, particularly in times of crisis. However, weaknesses, we've already said it's reductionist. It doesn't account for religious belief in mentally healthy people or mentally healthy people that aren't religious that suddenly become religious. And it doesn't address the possibility that the object of the belief, i.e. God, might actually exist. Okay, Karl Marx. We will have heard of Karl Marx in terms of communism. Especially if you've done history, you will have come across Karl Marx. Okay, so he says that religion is a social construct used to oppress the working class. It keeps people passive. If you are promised something in the afterlife, you don't worry about what's happening now. You accept it and move forward with this idea of it being a test or a veil of soul making, or because there's going to be this promise of an afterlife. So it keeps people, well, passive is a good word, right? It keeps people passive, and it doesn't encourage people to question or criticise or, fight against things that they perceive to be wrong. So Karl Marx says that religion is the opium of the people because it numbs pain, stops you being worried about things, and stops rebellion. So, strengths of this argument then. It highlights how religion can support social hierarchy, and it can also help to maintain inequality. Okay, you've only got to look at the power that the Catholic Church had during medieval times to see that. Okay? And it explains why oppressed communities cling to religion, because it's the only hope they've got. If they look at the true picture of what they've got in this world, then bloody hell, it's depressing. So you've got to, it gives them that thing of, well, there's something better coming, and it keeps that hope alive. Weaknesses, it does ignore when religious people inspire social reform. So if you think about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, both religious people, one Christian, one Muslim, they inspired and were part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Without that, it's doubtful that we would be where we are now. So their religion, their faith, led them to do exactly the opposite of what Karl Marx is saying. So think about that. And it also overlooks the diversity of religious belief and practice. So it's not like there is one religion in the world that's doing everything for everybody. There are different religions across the world. So, and that includes people that are not in a capitalist society. So why do they need religion then? Because if it's an operational tool of capitalism for keeping you oppressed, well, why would you need it in a situation where you're not capitalist? But yet we still do have it. So, okay, then we've got new atheism. This is, a famous proponent of this is Richard Dawkins. So this claims that religion is irrational. It's not supported by evidence. Faith is a cop-out or an excuse to avoid thinking critically. And religious indoctrination of children is a form of psychological harm. So it does damage to people, indoctrinating them into a form of religion. Strengths. It does look at scientific method and reason, and the fact that we are struggling to scientifically prove the existence of God. On a side note, we also can't prove that he doesn't exist either, but, for this purpose, that's a strength. It critiques harmful effects of religious extremism and fundamentalism. You've only got to look at, Islamic extremism in the form of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is our most recent exposure to religious extremism. But also during the 70s and 80s. You had the IRA in the UK as well. However, weaknesses of that, it fails to distinguish between moderate religious beliefs and extreme ones. Like everybody who is a Christian or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Jew or a Hindu is not an extreme view. So that's not everybody, is it? Most people are moderately somewhere in the middle. And it's also quite dismissive of the depth of culture that there is around religion and philosophy. Like, it's not just, a few points that you believe and hope for best. It's like there is, there are entire subjects dedicated and related to this, so it's quite dismissive of that. So, a couple of quotes then. Religion is the opium of the people, that's Karl Marx, and faith is the great cop-out from Richard Dawkins. Okay, so segment 4 then, we're going to look at some key scholars and quotes. If you want top-level exam responses, you need more than just ideas. You need to back it up with evidence. And the evidence that we look for as examiners and as your teachers marking your essays is scholars. If you can back it up with scholars, you're on a good path. Okay? So, problem of evil and suffering. You've got Augustine, evil is a privation of good. Leibniz, the best of all possible worlds. Irenaeus, suffering allows us to grow into the likeness of God. And John Hick, the soul-making theodicy. The soul-making theodicy. Religious experience, we've got William James, the feeling, acts and experiences in relation to what they consider the divine. We've got Richard Swinburne's Principles of Credulity and Testimony. Freud, religion is a universal obsessional neurosis. And Persinger, you can talk about the God helmet. In terms of challenges to belief, you've got the idea of Freud with his idea of religion as wish fulfillment and projection. Karl Marx, religion is the opium of the people. And Dawkins, faith is the great cop-out. So when it comes to a tape for scholars, can you explain what the quote means? Can you apply it to an essay question? And can you argue both for and against? That is important. Don't use a quote that you feel you can't argue for and against, because this is evaluation, so you need to be able to argue both sides. Okay, segment 5, quick revision strategy, exam planning drills. So this is planning essays under timed conditions. Alright, so a 15-minute exam drill. Number 1, pick a past 40-mark question. For example, critically assess the claim that the existence of evil disproves God. Set a 5-minute timer to brainstorm your intro, 3 main points and a conclusion. And use whichever essay skeleton you've got, whether that is PoR or cats and rats or whatever it is. And then number 4, review it. After that 5 minutes, did you get AO1 and AO2 and scholars in there? Could you turn that into a proper essay? Okay, and that is your way of checking whether you can do it. So your challenge then, do 3 essay plans before the next episode. So use different topics and always include at least 2 named scholars per plan. I would say try for 3. At least. Okay, that's the end of today's episode of the Faith and Focus podcast. So in the next episode, we will complete the philosophy of religion paper with religious language, miracles, and life after death. So a lot of people find these quite tough, but they do link science, logic, and faith together. We'll look at the key theories, criticisms, and how to tackle the hardest questions on the paper. So until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and keep learning. Bye!